The convoy was 20 miles long. Trucks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, supply wagons, everything the German 10th Army owned, stretched bumper to bumper along Highway 6, inching north through the darkness. It was May 30th, 1944, and every vehicle carried men who should have been prisoners. Lieutenant Hans Becker sat in the back of a supply truck, squeezed between two other soldiers. They'd been retreating for 5 days straight, and none of them believed they'd make it. The intelligence reports were clear. American forces from Anzio were closing in on the road. When that happened, the trap would snap shut. Becker had already written letters home. He'd addressed them carefully, knowing they'd be found on his body after capture. But the Americans never came. Hour after hour, the convoy crawled north. By dawn, Becker and his unit had passed the critical junction at Valmontone. They were through. Behind them, thousands more German vehicles continued streaming north through the gap. What should have been a catastrophic encirclement became an organized retreat. The German soldiers didn't understand their luck. Their commanders did. American General Mark Clark had turned his entire attack force away from Highway 6 and redirected it toward Rome. One man's decision had saved an entire army. And talking about decisions, here's one that's way easier. Hitting that subscribe button helps us bring more stories like this. But to understand how a general handed the enemy what military historians call one of the most controversial gifts in modern warfare, let's rewind to January. For months earlier, the Italian campaign was dying of frustration. Since landing at Salerno in September 1943, Allied forces had been grinding north through mountains and mud, bleeding for every mile. By December, they'd hit the Gothic Line, a German defensive position that ran across Italy like a concrete wall. At its center stood Monte Cassino, an ancient monastery perched on a mountaintop with a perfect view of every approach. Allied commanders threw 4 separate offensives at Cassino. All 4 failed. Winston Churchill was furious. The Italian campaign was supposed to be the soft underbelly of Europe, a quick route to knock Italy out of the war and threaten Germany from the south. Instead, it had become a meat grinder that consumed divisions without producing results. The British Prime Minister demanded something bold. His answer was Operation Shingle, an amphibious landing behind German lines at Anzio, a small coastal town 30 miles south of Rome. The concept was elegant. If Allied forces could land at Anzio and push inland to the Alban Hills, they'd cut the main supply routes to the German armies at Cassino. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, would face an impossible choice: defend Rome or save his armies in the south. Either way, the Gothic Line would collapse. Churchill envisioned a wildcat landing on the shore, tearing into the German rear. What he got was something else entirely. Major General John Lucas commanded 6 Corps, the force chosen for Anzio. He was methodical, cautious, and deeply pessimistic about the operation. Lucas believed the landing was too risky, that his forces were too small for the mission, that the entire plan relied on German incompetence. During planning meetings, he privately compared Shingle to Gallipoli, the disastrous World War I amphibious assault that had haunted Churchill ever since. Lucas wasn't wrong to be nervous. The beach at Anzio sat in flat, marshy terrain surrounded by hills. If the Germans recovered from initial surprise and brought up reinforcements, 6 Corps would be trapped in a fishbowl with enemy artillery looking down from every direction. But Lucas had his orders, and on January 22, 1944, the landing went forward. The assault achieved complete tactical surprise. 40,000 Allied troops and 3,000 vehicles poured ashore at Anzio with minimal opposition. German forces in the area were scattered and confused. The road to Rome stood open. Kesselring later admitted he'd been eating dinner when the first reports arrived, and his initial reaction bordered on panic. Everything the Allies needed to do, push inland, seize the high ground, cut the highways, was achievable in those first 48 hours. Lucas didn't push. He consolidated the beachhead. He built up supplies. He fortified defensive positions. He did everything by the book except the one thing that mattered: advancing. Every hour Lucas waited, German reinforcements were racing toward Anzio from across Italy. Kesselring pulled battalions from the Gothic Line, rushed training units south, even diverted forces from France and Yugoslavia. Within 2 days, he'd assembled enough troops to contain the beachhead. Within a week, he had enough to counterattack. German commanders couldn't believe their luck. They'd expected an immediate thrust into the Alban Hills that would have been nearly impossible to stop. Instead, the Americans were digging foxholes on the beach. One German officer later testified that if Lucas had advanced on January 23, nothing could have prevented the collapse of the entire defensive system south of Rome. But Lucas was protecting his forces, following doctrine, making sure his beach was secure. He was doing his job, just not the job that needed doing. By early February, the opportunity had evaporated. Kesselring launched a massive counteroffensive designed to drive 6 Corps back into the sea. German infantry, supported by tanks, attacked down the via Anzio Strait toward the port. The fighting was savage and desperate. Allied forces fell back nearly to the beaches before naval gunfire and air support finally stopped the German advance. But the damage was done. The beachhead that was supposed to outflank the Germans had become a second static front. On February 22, General Mark Clark replaced Lucas with Lucian Truscott. Truscott was everything Lucas wasn't. Aggressive, innovative, loved by his troops, willing to take risks. The men of the 3rd Infantry Division, which he'd commanded through Sicily and up the Italian boot, called him the toughest general in the army. He wore cavalry boots and a white scarf, spoke in a distinctive gravelly voice, and had a reputation for showing up at the front when things got dangerous. His soldiers trusted him because Truscott understood something fundamental. Sometimes the safest course of action was the most aggressive one. But even Truscott couldn't break out immediately. The beachhead had stabilized into a killing ground 7 miles deep and 15 miles wide. German artillery in the Alban Hills could range every position. There was no cover, no rear area, no safe place. Soldiers at Anzio lived in waterlogged foxholes, ate cold rations, and died from random shelling. They learned to identify the Anzio Express, a German railway gun that fired 560-pound shells that screamed through the air like freight trains. Cooks and clerks were dying just as often as infantrymen. The psychological strain was crushing. Combat fatigue rates at Anzio exceeded anything seen in other theaters. Between January and May 1944, 6 Corps suffered over 43,000 casualties. 7,000 men killed, 36,000 wounded or missing. Some divisions lost half their strength and had to be rebuilt with replacements who'd never seen combat. The 45th Infantry Division, in continuous action since the first wave, was down to skeleton crews led by second lieutenants fresh from training. Doctors performed surgery in tents while artillery landed nearby. The wounded were being hit again while waiting for evacuation. Families across America were receiving telegrams. 5,000 mothers and fathers learned their sons had died on a beach that was supposed to end the Italian stalemate in days. Instead, Anzio had become exactly what it was meant to prevent, a static battle of attrition that consumed lives without producing victory. On May 11, 1944, the situation finally changed. Operation Diadem began with the largest artillery bombardment in the Italian campaign, 1,600 Allied guns opening fire on German positions along the Gothic Line. General Marshal Alexander had planned Diadem as a coordinated offensive using every division in Italy. The British 8th Army would attack in the east. The American 5th Army would attack in the center. French colonial troops would assault through the mountains. And once the Germans were fully engaged, 6 Corps would break out of Anzio and trap the retreating enemy. The plan was sound. The Germans couldn't defend everywhere simultaneously. If Allied forces attacked on multiple fronts and broke through, Kesselring's armies would be caught with no escape route. For 5 months, the Anzio beachhead had been waiting for this moment. Now the chance had arrived. The Gothic Line crumbled. Polish forces captured Monte Cassino after brutal fighting. British and Canadian troops broke through and began advancing up the Liri Valley. American forces pushed north. By May 23, the German defenses were collapsing, and Kesselring ordered a fighting withdrawal toward Rome. His armies were retreating up Highway 6 in relatively good order, but they were vulnerable. If 6 Corps could break out of Anzio and cut that highway, the entire German 10th Army would be trapped. Truscott attacked on May 23 with overwhelming force. 4 months of preparation had turned 6 Corps into a powerful striking force. The 1st Armored Division led the advance, infantry divisions following behind. German positions that had contained them for months were overrun in hours. By May 25, advanced elements were approaching Valmontone, the critical crossroads where Highway 6 could be cut. Intelligence reports confirmed the worst-case scenario for the Germans. The 10th and 14th Armies were converging on Highway 6, creating a massive traffic jam of troops and vehicles with nowhere else to go. Truscott reported to Clark that the trap was working exactly as planned. The door was closing. German units were bunching up, becoming more vulnerable by the hour. This wasn't just an opportunity to block a road. This was a chance to destroy the entire German presence south of Rome. One more push, maybe 24 hours, and Highway 6 would be cut. The 10th Army would have to surrender or be annihilated. Then Mark Clark arrived at Truscott's headquarters with new orders. The bulk of 6 Corps would turn northwest toward Rome immediately. Only a single division and the Special Service Force would continue toward Valmontone. The main effort was being redirected. Clark's reasoning was straightforward: Rome was within reach. The German defenses in that direction were weaker. A fast thrust could take the city in days. Besides, intelligence suggested that Kesselring might have enough reserves near Valmontone to stop an attack there. Truscott requested clarification. He showed Clark the intelligence indicating how vulnerable the German armies were on Highway 6. He explained that taking Rome meant nothing if the German 10th Army escaped intact to defend northern Italy. Clark listened to Truscott's arguments, acknowledged them, and repeated his orders: turn northwest toward Rome. The decision stood. After Clark left, Truscott stood at his map table in cold fury. His staff waited for instructions, uncertain what their commander would do. One officer later described Truscott's expression as controlled rage. Here's a quick aside before we continue. If you're tired of AI-generated war stories and want deep research with real archival footage, the membership link is below. We're historians, not algorithms. Anyway, Truscott told his staff he'd never disobeyed a direct order in his career, and he wasn't starting now, even though he believed the order was catastrophically wrong. They'd execute the turn toward Rome. But first, Truscott made one final attempt to salvage the situation. He sent his most aggressive units toward Highway 6 with orders to cut the road regardless of what the rest of 6 Corps was doing. If they could block it, even temporarily, it might be enough. The 3rd Infantry Division and 1st Special Service Force pushed hard toward Valmontone. They reached positions overlooking Highway 6 on May 30th. From their vantage point, they could see German vehicles backed up for miles, moving slowly north in a long, vulnerable column. Artillery observers called fire missions on the packed convoy. It wasn't enough. 2 divisions couldn't block an entire highway against the German 10th Army determined to escape. The Germans fought through with heavy casualties, but they got through. Truscott watched from his command post as the opportunity dissolved. Everything 6 Corps had suffered for 4 months at Anzio had been to create this moment. And Clark had thrown it away for a photograph. Between May 26th and June 4th, over 100,000 German troops escaped what should have been an encirclement. The retreat became an organized withdrawal. Kesselring's armies lived to fight again. German commanders later testified they'd expected to be trapped. Their intelligence had tracked 6 Corps moving toward Valmontone. They knew Highway 6 was their only viable escape route. When 6 Corps suddenly turned toward Rome instead, they couldn't believe what was happening. Kesselring called it a miracle. He'd prepared orders for the 10th Army to stand and fight at Valmontone, accepting that most of the force would be lost. When the American attack never came, he immediately ordered all forces to retreat through the gap before it closed. The Germans conducted a fighting withdrawal, leaving rear guards to slow pursuit, destroying bridges behind them. But they were retreating, not surrounded. They moved their artillery, their vehicles, their entire command structure. By June 4th, the last major German units had passed through and were establishing new defensive positions north of Rome. Kesselring later wrote that if Highway 6 had been cut at Valmontone, he would have lost the entire 10th Army. His only option would have been surrender. The Italian campaign would have ended in June 1944 instead of continuing until May 1945. But on June 4th, Clark wasn't thinking about lost opportunities. He was entering Rome. He made sure photographers were present to document his arrival. He also made sure British forces weren't present. Clark had ordered military police to block roads and prevent British units from entering Rome alongside American troops. The images show Clark standing in a jeep, waving to crowds, touring historical sites. The headlines proclaimed Rome's liberation as a great American victory. Clark held a press conference the same day, praising 5th Army without mentioning the German forces escaping to the north. The celebration lasted exactly 2 days. On June 6th, Allied forces landed in Normandy. D-Day became the biggest story of the war. Clark's Rome victory was pushed to the back pages within hours. The headlines he'd sacrificed 100,000 prisoners to achieve were forgotten before the week ended. Every decision could mean survival or annihilation, Clark's decision just meant longer war. Your decision is easier. Hit subscribe to support deep research like this. British commanders were scathing in private. Alexander wrote that the opportunity to trap the German 10th Army had been thrown away for publicity. He believed Clark had violated the spirit of his orders and cost the Allies 6 months of additional fighting. American commanders were divided. Some agreed that Rome had symbolic importance. Others believed Truscott had been right, that destroying the German army mattered more than capturing cities. The debate continued, but the Germans weren't debating. They were digging in north of Rome, preparing to defend the Gothic Line. The German forces that escaped established positions along the Gothic Line, a defensive system running across northern Italy from Pisa to Rimini. The line utilized mountain terrain, concrete bunkers, minefields, and obstacles that had been under construction since early 1944. Allied forces reached the Gothic Line in August and immediately encountered fierce resistance. The Germans who'd escaped at Highway 6 were manning those defenses. The attacks on the Gothic Line cost the Allies 50,000 casualties between August and December 1944. American, British, Canadian, Polish, Brazilian, and Indian troops died assaulting positions defended by Germans who should have been prisoners. The German 10th Army, which could have been destroyed in June, reformed and continued fighting. Veterans who'd escaped in May were killing Allied soldiers in September. The Italian campaign continued until May 2, 1945, almost a full year after Clark took Rome. The Gothic Line was never fully broken by assault. German forces only surrendered when Germany itself collapsed. Military historians estimate the German forces that escaped were responsible for approximately 60,000 Allied casualties in subsequent fighting. That's a conservative number that only counts direct combat deaths. In 1954, Truscott published his memoirs. He dedicated an entire chapter to Clark's decision. His assessment was devastating. Truscott wrote that Clark had sacrificed a decisive victory for personal glory and that American soldiers had paid the price. He stated explicitly that he'd argued against turning toward Rome, that intelligence had shown 100,000 Germans vulnerable to encirclement, that every senior officer at 6 Corps knew the Valmontone trap would work if given 24 more hours. British Field Marshal Alexander was more diplomatic but equally clear. He wrote that failure to cut Highway 6 allowed German forces to escape that could have been destroyed, prolonging the campaign significantly. Kesselring confirmed the Allied assessment. He stated he'd expected to lose the 10th Army. Several German division commanders testified they were preparing to surrender when they learned Highway 6 was still open. Clark never publicly acknowledged his decision was wrong. In his memoirs, he defended the turn toward Rome as strategically sound, arguing the city had political and symbolic value that justified the operational risk. The historical consensus hasn't been kind. Most military historians conclude the decision was driven by personal ambition rather than military necessity. The opportunity to destroy the German 10th Army was real and achievable. There's a question buried in all this data, underneath the casualty figures and the maps showing arrows turning the wrong direction. It's the question that makes this story matter beyond the tactical details of one battle in 1944. The question is simple. When does personal ambition override operational necessity? Where's the line between wanting recognition for your achievements and sacrificing the mission for that recognition? Clark wasn't a coward or incompetent. He'd led Fifth Army through difficult campaigns, made hard decisions, and shared danger with his troops. But something happened in late May 1944 that revealed a fundamental truth about command. The higher you climb, the more your personal ambitions can cost the people you're supposed to protect. Clark wanted Rome more than he wanted to win the war efficiently. He wanted the photographs more than he wanted the surrender documents. And because he commanded Fifth Army, what he wanted determined what happened. Think about it this way. Every soldier who died on the Gothic Line after August 1944 was killed by a decision made in May. Every family that received a telegram in the fall saying their son wouldn't be coming home was mourning someone whose death might have been prevented if Highway 6 had been cut. The price wasn't paid in Clark's reputation. It was paid in lives. If you're finding value in this deep dive into how ambition shapes history, that subscribe button helps us keep telling these stories the right way. The Germans who escaped didn't blame Clark for their survival. They thanked him. They went home to their families after the war and rebuilt Germany knowing they'd been given an unexpected chance. But the Allied soldiers who had to fight them again on the Gothic Line, in the mountains north of Florence, through the winter of 1944, they paid for Clark's ambition with months of additional combat, with friends dying in snow and mud, with wounds that never fully healed. Here's what makes this complicated. Clark was right that Rome mattered. The symbolic value of liberating the First Axis capital was real. The political pressure to deliver victories was enormous. Fifth Army had been fighting in Italy since Salerno, and they deserved recognition. But strategy isn't about choosing between right and wrong. It's about choosing between competing goods and determining which one costs less. Clark chose short-term glory over long-term victory. He chose headlines over efficiency. And in making that choice, he guaranteed the war would last longer than necessary. Truscott understood this. That's why his anger was so cold and controlled. He wasn't upset about violated orders or military protocol. He was furious because he knew the price would be paid by the men in his corps, the soldiers who'd spent 4 months at Anzio waiting for this moment. When Truscott turned his back on the spectators and faced the graves at the Necino Cemetery on Memorial Day 1945, he wasn't apologizing for military failure. He was apologizing for the times when decisions were made that valued the wrong things. The aftermath tells you everything about how these decisions echo. Rome fell on June 4, 1944, and was a front-page story for 48 hours. The Gothic Line held from August 1944 until April 1945, and most people today couldn't tell you where it was. Clark got his photographs. Kesselring got his escape. The soldiers got more war. In some alternate version of history, 6 Corps cuts Highway 6. The German 10th Army surrenders. Kesselring pulls back to the Alps immediately. The Italian campaign ends by summer. Thousands of soldiers go home who instead died fighting through autumn and winter. The headlines still announce Rome's liberation, just with different details about how many prisoners were taken. Clark still gets recognition, just not the exclusive photographs he wanted. Would that have been better? Objectively, yes. Strategically, obviously. Morally, without question. But it wouldn't have satisfied what Clark needed, which was to be first into Rome, to claim that city as his victory, to have that moment belong exclusively to Fifth Army and not be shared with British Eighth Army advancing from the south. That's the thing about ego at the command level. It doesn't just affect the person making the decision. It ripples down through every subordinate unit, every company, every squad, until it reaches the individual soldier crouching in a foxhole on the Gothic Line wondering why the war is still going. And those soldiers never know the full story. They fight and die and don't understand that the battle they're in exists because someone wanted a photograph more than they wanted efficiency. There's a brutal calculus in warfare. Every decision trades lives for objectives. Good commanders make those trades consciously, deliberately, trying to minimize the cost while achieving the goal. But what happens when the objective is personal recognition? How do you calculate the exchange rate of American lives for one general's glory? The historical record is clear on this. Clark's decision was wrong. It prolonged the war. It cost lives. It let the enemy escape when they should have been captured. Every credible historian who's examined the evidence reaches the same conclusion. And yet Clark died in 1984, still defending his choice, still believing Rome justified everything. Here's what we're left with: a bridge that was almost cut, a convoy that almost didn't escape, a war that almost ended sooner. History is littered with these almosts, these moments when the trajectory could have changed if someone had made a different choice. Anzio was supposed to be the decisive blow that broke the Italian stalemate. Instead, it became a 4-month nightmare that created the conditions for a decisive blow, which was then redirected for publicity. The soldiers who survived Anzio and then had to fight through the Gothic Line carried that knowledge with them. They knew. They'd been there when Truscott received Clark's orders. They'd watched the German convoys streaming north through gaps that should have been closed. And when they died on Monte Battaglia or in the approaches to Bologna, they died knowing it didn't have to be this way. Truscott never forgave Clark. That much is clear from his memoirs, from his testimony to historians, from the way he spoke about the decision decades later. But forgiveness isn't really the point. The point is understanding how ambition operates at the highest levels of command, how the pressure for recognition can override strategic necessity, how the desire for headlines can cost lives. Clark wanted to be Caesar entering Rome. He got his wish. But the price was paid by soldiers who never got to choose whether that wish was worth their lives. That's the real story of Anzio, not the failed landing or the terrible stalemate, but the moment when victory was achievable and was deliberately thrown away for the sake of one man's ego. For the full unfiltered version of stories like this, with all the details and archival footage we can't show here. Check out the membership link below. 4,400 Americans died at Anzio between January and May 1944, creating the opportunity to trap the German 10th Army. That opportunity existed for approximately 48 hours in late May. Clark chose Rome instead. The Germans escaped. The war continued. And every soldier who died after June 4, 1944, fighting the German 10th Army in northern Italy was paying interest on a debt that should never have existed. When Kesselring surrendered in May 1945, nearly a year after Rome fell, he was still commanding forces that should have been destroyed at Valmontone. Some of the divisions that faced Allied troops in the final battles were the same units that had escaped through the gap Clark left open. The war ended. Germany collapsed. But the Italian campaign took 11 months longer than necessary because one general wanted photographs more than he wanted victory. That's not speculation. That's what the evidence shows, what the German commanders testified, what the casualty figures prove. Highway 6 could have been cut. The trap would have worked. Clark knew this and chose differently. And that choice, more than any battle or tactical decision, defines his legacy. Rome was captured. The photographs were taken. The headlines ran for 2 days. And soldiers kept dying for a year because the general wanted his moment in the sun more than he wanted to end the war.